He's a great personal friend of mine, has been my editor, he is my neighbor. He is a great intellectual for helping to explain the fundamental nature of this capitalist crisis that we are in. I'm going as quickly as I can, and I'm going to turn it over to him right now. So please, if you could warmly welcome to help us bring a little understanding as well as some emotion to this brilliant, brilliant day, Victor Wallis.
I hope I can live up to that marvelous introduction. It's an enormous honor to speak here with the Howard Zinn Memorial Lecture. I was a great admirer of Howard, had an opportunity to host him at my institutions on 2 different occasions, and he's a terrific example for all of us. So I hope you all read.
Can you scream?
Yeah,
they're making us. They're taking this from us for the march.
Oh, so I'll have to. I'll talk loud. Okay.
You guys move on in if you want. What's that? Hey.
Come on closer. I have to.
Can someone announce?
Don't mind, I'm trying to get. It's good to see you again.
Yeah.
Come on in, folks. If you want to understand this, not just march against it, we gotta pull on in.
I'll talk loud, but I can't talk that loud.
Sorry, I couldn't find it.
Okay.
Seriously.
So the plan is for me to speak for no more than about 20 minutes, so that then we can have some conversation. And I've just tried to sum up some essential points. I think the great significance of this moment in history is that it shows the recognition on the part of large numbers of people, especially young people, of the systemic nature of the crisis, that it's not this or that policy, not this or that administration, but that the whole system is what is at issue. It's the whole system which systemically creates the problem. I want to go a little bit into that, and then we can get also into the question of how this might relate to any particular detailed policy demands you might make. But the crisis is, of course, of a level that hasn't been known in this country since the 1930s. It's not since then that there's been this level of unemployment, homelessness, and so on. And there are things that we can learn from the 1930s at an immediate policy level, which are quite obvious, which have not been part of the discussion. The big achievement, positive achievement of the government in the 1930s was the idea that the government could actually create jobs. The government could hire people to do useful things. Nothing of that is in the discourse that we hear today. It's all about just coaxing, cajoling the private sector to somehow come into play and do its thing, which it systematically doesn't do. It won't do it. So, and to those who say that government is inherently inefficient, I would simply mention one of the outcomes of the 1930s, which is the Social Security system, which is one of the most efficient, that is to say, lowest percentage of overhead for the amount of turnover that it has of any service. So it is a great example. It can be done, and the government type of useful employment is something that hires many more people for the amount of investment that it requires. Anyway, however, despite all those, we have to recognize those achievements, but we also have to recognize the insufficiency, the shortfall of that whole period. Because the point was, they didn't take power away from capital, finally. It was limited slightly because of the strength of the popular movements, but it wasn't taken away. And what does that mean? Eventually, bit by bit, they're going to take it back. And that's what they've been doing, really, in the last 30, 40 years especially. And this has really come into high gear. It goes back to the 1970s. And I think the best analysis that you can get of this is in a videotape 1-hour lecture by Professor Rick Wolff. How many of you have seen that? It's called Capitalism Hits the Fan. You can just look that up, Capitalism Hits the Fan, on the internet. In brief, what he points out in that lecture, but with much more detail and a very lively presentation, is that starting in the early 1970s, what had been the case, the kind of truce between capital and labor, whereby as productivity increased, so also did wages, that was broken by capital. They launched a kind of class war against labor. No more wage increases. Essentially, wages stagnated since that time, whereas capital continued to flow in. You had this huge concentration just of liquid wealth, which gave birth to the whole financialization, speculation, all the phenomena that we see that culminated in the bubble that led to the crash of 2008. So check out Rick Wolff on that. Now, the thing I want to say is, in terms of all the arguments about this movement, that the fact that we point at a critique of the system as a whole doesn't mean that we are not interested in particular demands. But what we do have to insist is that the working out of those demands, the formulation of them, has to be carried out within the framework of an understanding of the systemic nature of the problem. And given that understanding, our long-term goal is to actually achieve a shift of class power. The short-term goal, it's not that short-term, it's still a long thing, is to build a popular movement, to increase the scope and the presence and the independence of the popular movement so that it can culminate eventually in a political organization that would have the capacity to rule. In other words, to take power away from the 1%. You're not going to take power away from the 1% or the 0.1% just by proposing reforms. They won't give them. I heard what Jeffrey Sachs was saying, the corporations shouldn't be running the government. Well, the corporations will inevitably try to run the government. That's what they have to do in order to function. So the power has to be taken away from them altogether. But it can't be done all at once. But the movement has to be animated by the awareness that that's what's ultimately necessary. And that's the question. Can we develop a movement that goes far beyond what was done in the 1930s? So regarding capitalism in general, this rich get richer, poor get poorer phenomenon is built into capitalism. It's been there all along. There have been periods and moments in particular countries, even in this country at certain times, where that polarization has been offset, has been reduced, but it always comes back. They always try to bring it back. In that sense, that the class conflict is continual. And anyone who says that by protesting that we're initiating class warfare overlooks the fact that class warfare goes on all the time anyway. It's just a question of what is the relative strength of the opposed parties. And certainly the difference between rich and poor globally has increased dramatically over time, and nowadays it's increasing sharply within the more advanced countries. Some of the factors in this, sort of bringing about this present crisis, apart from what Wolf points out about the concentration, the financialization, I think the end of what I call the first epoch socialism, the collapse of the imperfect, but let's say in retrospect, experimental regimes of the first 70 years since the Russian Revolution left capital with a seemingly clear field, what was called the end of history, the idea that there was no alternative. That was the famous phrase of Margaret Thatcher. Well, that was important, not because those regimes were any great models, but because their very presence forced capital, or its political representatives, to recognize that they would need to make concessions to accept progressive social reforms in order not to have, in order for them not to be displaced or thrown out. Now they think they can do anything. They can get away with anything. They can bomb any country at will and so on. And they don't have to worry about what people think they can. And so you get this sort of untrammeled aggressiveness domestically, where they're busting unions. And of course we had the Wisconsin president as a reaction against that, which has inspired our movement now. They're busting unions, and even now, as you may have read in the last few weeks, all these states are introducing measures to take away the right to vote from poor people. Of course they dress that up under slogans like, well, having an ID, or redesigning districts, or not voting on Sunday, or this, that, or the other. But it's basically aimed against poor people, and it's been calculated that the restriction of the franchise could affect as many as 5 million people. So it's becoming much more aggressive, and this is one of the immediate factors that's also stimulated the growth of this movement. The point is then, where was I?
Take your time.
Yeah. So the representatives of capital, they're sort of going all out in pursuit of their immediate interests, and of course, as a result, they end up provoking popular outrage, which finally is beginning to take a kind of clear form of recognizing the underlying causes. And so this was the problem. The early reactions against it, which were heavily funded and stimulated and encouraged by the right wing, they'd look at superficial manifestations of one kind or another, like an inadequate health care bill and so on, and demonize that, call it all kinds of names and so on. But now we're actually raising the question of where the power in the society lies and what the real causes of the underlying problems are. And the problem we have to recognize, and that everybody has recognized in terms of their immediate political practice, is that the Democrats are at the leadership level. I'm not saying every single Democratic politician, but at the leadership level, the Democratic Party is totally and completely bound up with capital, and the symbiosis, the sort of cooperation between the Democrats and the Republicans is absolutely it's unbreakable in a way. I felt it when I got an appeal from the Democratic Senatorial Campaign Committee to contribute to them because of all the terrible and crazy and zany things the Tea Party was doing. And I said to myself, what would the Democrats do without the Tea Party? They love it. And that's when the media give all this attention to the Tea Party, much more than to the content of what we're doing. They only began to give attention to our movement when there was sort of police misconduct and so on. We had to sort of depend on them for that to happen. So that much, I think that with the outcome of the 2008 election, it's become much clearer to people what the Democratic Party really represents, and that it doesn't represent the kind of hope that we must have for transformation, for real change of the kind that a lot of people began to think might be possible with the election of Obama. Other factors that have come into play to help us along are, of course, the role of the alternative media. I won't go on too much about that except to recommend programs like Democracy Now! And sources locally like Open Media Boston, which is giving excellent coverage to this movement and which is a kind of forum for all kinds of discussion. And of course the examples of people's movements around the world. So the only danger, I think, the risk, I mean, in terms of the political outcome of this process is that the energy that's been developed here will get siphoned off into some kind of support for Democratic candidates. Whereas I think what we need to do primarily is to broaden the focus of the discussion, get it out of the realm of just sort of which candidate can be put into office, because if that's all it is, the vote doesn't make much difference. We see the change from one administration to another, and a continuity in terms of the top economic advisors, foreign policy, military, absolute continuity. So this does raise, in terms of the long-term objectives, the question of socialism. And now the interesting thing about socialism is that word has been used an incredibly increased number of times in the last few years to mischaracterize Obama. And it's extraordinary how it's been brought into the national discourse. And I think that there are many indications that the effect of this has somewhat backfired on those who have done that, because it has raised the interest in socialism. And according to surveys that were conducted now over a year ago, there's a considerable favorable disposition towards socialism, and especially among younger people, 30% in the under 30 age group is having a favorable view of socialism. So another book I wanted to recommend, that's kind of one that Howard Zinn would have liked a lot, is a new one. I don't know if any of you have seen this one. I show it to you. It's worth seeing. The S Word by John Nichols. John Nichols, who is a journalist in Wisconsin, a frequent contributor to The Nation magazine. The subtitle is A Short History of an American Tradition, Socialism. And it goes right back to Tom Paine, Abraham Lincoln and his correspondence with Karl Marx, and many of the icons of American culture.
Really?
Absolutely, yes. Yeah, you can read about it in this book. It's not to say that he agreed with him, but he was open. He read his columns in the New York Tribune. So it was interesting things. So it's sort of to finish up the basic presentation, because then we should have conversation, is that we can and must, of course, develop specific demands, but these demands always have to be developed within the context and the framework of building a movement and not just rallying behind some candidate or other. I mean, it's one thing to have candidates who say what we like, but what we want, if we're talking about candidates, we need candidates who come up from out of our movement and who are, in that sense, by definition, accountable to us, because they are of us. they're from our midst, and not someone who's come down to preach to us and seek our support. I think that's what we should look for. So I think I'll stop now and we have some conversation.
What's your name again, please?
Victor Wallis. Yeah.
I totally agree with you about where the election's not mattering too much, but the other day we were marching partially, they said to try to offer support for that jobs bill, which would have been better than nothing, and I know it's sort of not sufficient and not really what would, but wouldn't it if we had Democratic majorities, it would have been a little better, right?
Yeah, I mean, one can always support particular measures, but I think, you see, the big job in building a movement is political education. And political education means explaining what a real jobs bill would do. And even a short-term thing that doesn't involve a transformation of the system, but looking at the model of the 1930s and saying, create the jobs directly. Don't try to bribe people, bribe businesses to do it. And then you can say, well, given all this and under the circumstances that people need it, all right, so we support this thing. But always have the larger age in view. As they said in the 60s, keep the eyes on the prize. I mean, that's what has to be done.